great. I want to welcome everybody. We've had such an overwhelming response to today's event with 4 distinguished guests who are poets and writers themselves and who have found Rilke a source of inspiration and guidance on their personal journeys. They are coming to us from different places around the country and around the world. And I know that many of you are joining us from all over the world. So I want to welcome everybody to a truly global event on the Poets Corner. The Poets Corner was founded here in Midcoast, Maine, by myself and Catherine Seitz. Catherine, would you wave?
Hello.
To create community around writers and readers of poetry and short prose. And our guests always or generally have some connection to Maine. And today's connection is our host, Mark Burrows, who's a neighbor of ours. But before I turn it over to Catherine to introduce Mark, I'd like to just briefly tell you about our next event, which will be November 14th. So we usually do the second Sunday of the month at this time of day. And next event will be an ekphrastic poetry collaboration with the Page Gallery for their exhibition that's entitled Poetry in Motion. And if you go to our website, which is thepoetscorner.org, you'll find a link to the artwork in the exhibition, which is just incredibly beautiful and very poetic. And there will be details on how to submit your poems. If you want to write an ekphrastic poem to one of those, about one of those pieces of art and submit them, that would be great. All the details are on the website, and then we'll select some. The poets will select a group for reading on the Poets Corner on November 14th. And the artists will make another selection for reading in the gallery on November 20th. So keep that in mind, but let's focus on today's event. I am so thrilled to be having this event and so glad that Mark suggested it and has put it together. So Catherine, would you like to do the honors of introducing Mark?
Yes, thank you. Well, I've come to know Mark as a neighbor in the town of Camden and as a poet who was read previously on the Poets Corner. Since he suggested this reading about Rilke, I've been reading and learning more about Mark and his accomplishments as a scholar and award-winning translator of Rilke's poetry. He's translated Rilke's Book of Prayers and has a forthcoming book called Living the Questions with Rainer Maria Rilke. It's co-authored with Stephanie Dowrick. And Heart Work and the Art of Living, as well as new translation of Rilke's Sonnets to Orpheus. Mark's recent collection of his own poems is called The Chants of Home. Mark will introduce our other distinguished guests. Please join me in welcoming Mark and today's program.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Meg, and thank all of you who've joined us from all over the world for this very special afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you woke up or where you are currently living. This event has an energy that owes much to Rilke's own writings. We entitled it Reading Rilke, but in a sense, all of you who know Rilke's writings, his poems, his prose, understand when I say that Rilke's writing reads you. It reads what Rilke called the heart work that each of us is called to do, that das Herzwerk, the heart work. And he reminds us that poetry is not an emotion, it's an experience. And his poems in varied forms invite us to experience something deep, something vital, something only partially revealed, something puzzling about our own lives, about our own experience. They mirror for us the quest for self-understanding, for other understanding, for world understanding. And so today we're going to do that heart work through the guidance of three marvelous writers and readers of Rilke. I'll introduce them sequentially, and I'm very pleased that they all were so enthusiastic in accepting my invitation to join us for this event. Each of them will speak for about 15 minutes, and at the end of that time, we'll have a chance for the four of us to engage in a small roundtable discussion. And I invite you to post questions or insights in the chat function. We'll gather those for the last half hour of the program, so after an hour together. We'll receive those questions, those insights from you, and we'll comment on those together. We'll finish in 90 minutes. So a warm welcome to you. And first of all, join me in welcoming Laura Reece Hogan. Laura is a poet whose recent book, Litany of Flights, won the Paraclete Poetry Award this year. It's a marvelous collection. I read it when it was in draft form still, on the way to this prize. And what Laura brings in her writing is a deep attentiveness with Rilke to the world around us and the way that world mirrors something in us and mirrors itself in us. What Rilke called Weltinnenraum, this world inner space. She's a professed third order Carmelite, lives in Southern California, unusually has a JD degree and a master's degree in theology. I don't know how many of those there are, Laura, but I'm glad that you're one of them. In the poem she calls The Language of Open, let me just introduce her and close by reading the last several lines. These are her words. Honeybee gold in the glow of coming free. My petals reach wide, soak sunshine, unfurl the incense of an answer, open the drawbridge, spilling out one short syllable of surprised daybreak, dawnbreak, surrendering the lot, joying in loss, flaming into the splendid bloom of yes. Laura, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Mark, for that very kind introduction. And many thanks to the Poets Corner for hosting this event. And hello, everyone from all over the world, it seems. It's such a pleasure to be gathering with you today around the work of Rilke. I'd like to read 3 poems by Rilke to you today. The first is Evening, from the Book of Pictures, which is the second book in the Book of Hours. And this translation is by Stephen Mitchell. To me, this poem viscerally conveys a tension within each of us, all of us who live in the world, even as something in us longs for the transcendent. Rilke does something magical in this poem. He creates a vast distance between the material world, or stone, and the spiritual world, the transcendent world, or star. And then he collapses it into our own inward space. This is evening. The sky puts on the darkening blue coat held for it by a row of ancient trees. You watch, and the lands grow distant in your sight, one journeying to heaven, one that falls, and leave you not at home in either one. Not quite so still and dark as the darkened houses, not calling to eternity with the passion of what becomes a star each night and rises, and leave you inexpressibly to unravel your life with its immensity and fear, so that now bounded, now immeasurable, it is alternately stone in you and star. I love this poem because Rilke captures a contradiction about our being. On the one hand, we are very much grounded in our earthly existence. We are limited, we are mortal. We are living in the human condition, still and dark as the darkened houses. Yet on the other, there is something in us which constantly longs for and reaches for the transcendent, calling to eternity with the passion of what becomes a star each night. This poem so beautifully reveals the tension in this paradox of two simultaneous and competing realities of the material and spiritual worlds, between bounded and immeasurable, between doubt and faith, between death and life, between the stone and the star. Two contradictory things, two worlds, both very real at the same time. Which do we choose? Which is our home? We are always being challenged as we live our lives and make our choices to live out of the perspective of one or the other of these two worlds, now bounded, now immeasurable. I think it's so helpful to have Rilke's images of stone and star and their oscillation within us. I love and use a shorthand of stone and star as I navigate my own choices and perspective. Here's the poem once again. Evening. The sky puts on the darkening blue coat held for it by a row of ancient trees. You watch, and the lands grow distant in your sight. One journeying to heaven, one that falls, and leave you not at home in either one, not quite so still and dark as the darkened houses, not calling to eternity with the passion of what becomes a star each night and rises, and leave you inexpressibly to unravel your life with its immensity and fear, so that now bounded, now immeasurable, it is alternately stone in you and star. The next poem I will read to you is Wild Rosebush, which is an uncollected poem, and this translation is by Edward Snow. Roses play an important role in the work of Rilke and are sometimes depicted as an ultimately receptive, distilled eye, able to perceive what we cannot. And sometimes, as in the words Rilke wrote for his own gravestone, they are depicted as pure contradiction. In this poem, we have the entire rosebush as the subject. And I love this poem in particular because Rilke moves from kind of a contradictory description of the rosebush into a direct voicing by the rosebush itself. The rosebush addresses a wanderer with words that hold both wisdom and contradiction. Here is Wild Rosebush. How it stands out against the darkenings of the rainy evening, young and pure, in its tendrils arched everywhere in givingness, and yet absorbed in its rose being. The shallow flowers here and there already open, each one unasked for and untended, thus immeasurably exceeded by itself and indescribably self-aroused. It calls to the wanderer who in evening meditation comes past along the road. Oh, look at me, see, over here. how safe I am, and unprotected, and having all I need. Rilke's roses are, for me, a constant reminder of the way the natural world is always telling us something about the divine if we pay attention. The rosebush in this poem tells us something about that paradox we felt in the last poem, that distance and divide between the material reality and the spiritual reality. For me, this rosebush is a mystic that can inhabit and blossom in the contradiction between the material and spiritual.
We lost you, Laura. You got muted. Can you unmute?
Yes. How long have I been muted?
Just for the last sentence or two. But
Yes, only a
Okay.
moment. Sorry about that. If everybody
you.
else could make sure that they are muted, that would be wonderful.
So I was saying,
Sorry about
for
that,
me,
Laura.
this rosebush, oh, it's no problem. This rosebush to me is the mystic, because the rosebush can inhabit both of these worlds. And not only that, it knows how to boldly live in this tension of being so fragile. It can live between this outward, active exuberance, its tendrils arched everywhere and givingness, and an inward, almost contemplative absorption in its rose being. Moreover, it's a translator of the contradiction. It has something important to teach the wanderer and me. I am startled and constantly inspired by the rosebush's ability to root in that paradoxical space of somehow both being safe and unprotected in the world, like we all are, and yet confident and having all I need. Can we say that too? To me, this voicing by an ephemeral rosebush is a profound assertion of faith. This rosebush summons me, gives me a mantra. I can acknowledge these two competing realities. I am both safe, yes, and unprotected, yes, in this life. And here's the choice of my perspective, having all I need. Here's the poem again, Wild Rosebush. How it stands out against the darkenings of the rainy evening, young and pure, in its tendrils arched everywhere in givingness, and yet absorbed in its rose being. The shallow flowers here and there already open, each one unasked for and untended, thus immeasurably exceeded by itself and indescribably self-aroused. It calls to the wanderer who in evening meditation comes past along the road. Oh, look at me, see, over here, how safe I am, and unprotected, and having all I need. Both of these poems, Evening and Wild Rosebush, take place in the evening among darkenings, which hence are one of my favorite themes in Rilke, that of darkness. In Rilke's work, darkness is highly associated with the divine. As Mark mentioned, I'm a third order Carmelite. Carmelites are a religious order in the Catholic Church, and I am a lay Carmelite. So Rilke's depiction of God as dark and almost unknowable resonates with my spirituality. In Carmelite spirituality, particularly in the theology of John of the Cross, God may appear to be dark, a dark flame or ray, and unknown to us. Our path to God then is a negative way called the via negativa, a way of progressing toward God through darkness and unknowing. Here is the third poem from the Book of Monastic Life, translated by our own Mark S. Burrows in his Prayers of a Young Poet. Listen for the light and the darkness, the knowing and unknowing present in this poem. Many of my robed brothers and cloisters to the south dwell beneath the shade of bay trees. I see how their Madonnas look so utterly human and dream of Titian's paintings, how God glows in them like embers. But when I settle into my own soul, I know my God is dark and like a clump of 100 roots drinking silently. I lift myself from his warmth. More than this, I don't know, for my branches rest in the depths and sway gently in the winds. With this one powerful image,
What happened?
Rilke takes us deeply inward and captures the sense of a hidden, silent, yet present God. My God is dark and like a clump of 100 roots drinking silently. And yet this God is a generative warmth, roots from which the speaker grows. I love this image, especially in its vision of the human being as part of the organic world, a part of nature having her own sure natural development, which may be mysterious to her. This poem asks us to think about what the speaker knows and doesn't know, and what we know and don't know about God. This God is dark and silent, but close and warm. The speaker both knows something about God and yet also says, I don't know, which of course is true. Again, we feel that Rilkean paradox, which creates that feeling of both utter mystery and clear truth. And even though the speaker doesn't know much, there is an intuitive way forward. The final image of the speaker lifting like a tree out of God's warmth is a pivotal image for me. This God is an incredibly intimate God, a God who knows me, grows me, and is the ground of my being. It speaks to me in my prayer life, and I think the essence of it shows up in my own work. Here's Mark's beautiful translation once again. Many of my robed brothers and cloisters to the south dwell beneath the shade of bay trees. I see how their Madonnas look so utterly human and dream of Titian's paintings, how God glows in them like embers. But when I settle into my own soul, I know my God is dark and like a clump of 100 roots drinking silently. I lift myself from his warmth. More than this, I don't know, for my branches rest in the depths and sway gently in the winds. Thank you for listening to these Rilke poems, which are so meaningful to me. And now I will turn it back over to Mark.
Thank you, Laura, for such a moving and sensitive reading of Rilke. And that sense of the open that was so important to Rilke that shines through his writings, but also through your own. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's my privilege and joy to introduce our second speaker, Pádraig Tuama, who will be known to many of you, perhaps most of you, maybe even all of you, from his many appearances in the UK and Ireland on BBC radio and television, and in our own country through his work on Poetry Unbound, the name of a program that airs through Krista Tippett's On Being Studio. He has a book of that title coming out soon. And to introduce him, he's a theologian, an activist. He led the Coromila community in Northern Ireland for many years. and is, I guess, what the Germans would simply call a mensch, somebody who gets it at the deepest level, the joy and the anguish of life and how these belong in that rich tapestry of conversion, of transformation that we're all called into. A short reading from his wonderful collection that came out about 10 years ago, Readings from the Book of Exile. This is chapter 6, short poem. There is no ending. Everything is here. So pitch a tent that you can live in and find a friend to whom you'll give in times of telling, times of testing, times of listening, times of resting. There is no ending. Everything is here. Pádraig, welcome.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks very much to the Poets' Corner and Laura for that reading. It's a really lovely thing to be with you all, and I'm so glad to be in a group of people, all of whom are gathered around the unknowability, really, of Rilke and his words to us. I'm coming to you at the moment from Rhinebeck in the state of New York in the United States, and Rhinebeck is on the lands of the Munsee Lenape and the Mohican peoples. And I pay honor and respect to the citizens and languages and sovereignty of these peoples. I've chosen 4 poems from Mark's translation.
Can you just speak up a little bit or a little closer to the mic? Thank you.
See, I might be able to adjust the volume of my mic a bit.
That's better. We can all turn up our volume a little bit too.
Here, that should be a bit better now as well.
Excellent.
Great. I've chosen 4 poems, or 3 or 4 poems from Mark's translations of the Book of Hours. It was published by Paraclete Press in 2013. I am a newcomer to Rilke. I'm very definitely the new kid on the block when it comes to my esteemed colleagues here. I have read occasional Rilke poems for years, but last year I was in touch with a friend, Pat, and she lives in Glasgow, and we were facing into a long winter of lockdown. And I said, look, I need something to help me to get through these weeks. And so I said, why don't we choose a book of poems and we'll talk every Sunday about the poems that we've been reading from that book. And Pat said that she had just recently gotten Mark's book, this one here, Prayers of a Young Poet, and was looking forward to reading through it slowly. And I said, well, let's do that together. And so particularly, I suppose I'm here as the friend of anybody who's going, look, I know 1 or 2 things, but I'm new. So I'm learning so much by listening to my colleagues here. One of the things I really liked about this edition that Mark did was how studious Mark is as a translator, but also how he preserved the marginalia. That's part of the first book of the Book of Hours. So the Book of Hours is written kind of in the persona of a Russian monk. And all of these prayers or poems from this Russian monk come from that voice. And what's really interesting is that in the originals, Rilke had written these little notes, sometimes to just say, I wrote this during the dark night, or I wrote this in the early morning. But other times, the marginalia or notes, or however you would refer to them, are filled with information and are almost like a grounded reflection on the process, or what the weather was like, or what was growing, or what you could hear, or what was happening in the monastery. It's the most extraordinary fictionalized conversation between the prayer or poem, whatever you call it, and the imagined persona. And somehow this is almost like a conversation on process, and a conversation of the art, paying attention to the art. So I'm going to read some of these poems, and then I'll read the little marginalia too, because some of them are short and some of them are very vivid. Years ago, I heard a different translation of the second of the prayers in the Book of Hours, and this is the first one I'm going to read. It's very short. And the marginalia say, on the same evening as again wind and clouds appeared. I live my life in widening rings, which spread out to cover everything. I may not complete the last one, but I'll surely try. I'm circling around God, around the ancient tower, and I've been circling for thousands of years. and I don't yet know, am I a falcon, a storm, or a vast song? So I heard this a number of years ago, and I think after one hearing, I knew it off by heart already. Not because it all made sense to me, that's never the point, I think, but I felt it, and I was brought in somehow to the dream, to the imagining, to the prayer, to the intuition that's behind this poem. My own life has, like lots of ours, I suppose, lots of Irish Catholics of my age and older, my own life has been one where the church and questions of God were part of it, whether you liked it or not, for better and for worse. And the idea of a narrative of religion and a narrative of God, and a way within which your language and your culture and your politics and your education somehow were all in conversation with religion, with this idea of God, this power of God and God's interpreters. That has been absolutely part of my life. However, I've changed the older I've gotten, and I suppose the freer and the safer I've gotten. And one of the things that Rilke does so brilliantly is to use this word God, but not in a way where I recognize too much. Mostly it's strangeness that I'm brought into. And it's not that I want Rilke or any definition. I don't want to read a book called Rilke's God, where somebody says, here is exactly who Rilke's God is. I'm uninterested in that. It's the strangeness and the unput down, or the you can't pin it down, the unpinned down ability of Rilke's God that I find so interesting. And he speaks about God as the ancient tower in this poem. And there's that image of circling around God, the ancient tower, in these widening rings, as if God is the center, but perhaps the point is to go very far. So much of religious language in public is about recruitment and coming close to the religion and close to the practice. But in Rilke's understanding here, I found so much freedom to think, actually, maybe the point is to be in these widening rings, considering perhaps that whatever diameter I'm part of, whatever I'm radiating around, that is all part of going around that ancient tower. And I'm always moved by how regularly in the Book of Hours, when Rilke is asking the question about God, he ties it with the question of himself. And I love that, because perhaps what else is God but that which is experienced in the soul, and that in the temporary vessel of flesh and blood and bone and imagination, that is the place where a theological imagination takes place. And in the face of that, as Rilke is thinking about God, he asks himself these questions of himself. I've been circling around God, around the ancient tower, circling for thousands of years, and I still don't, and I don't yet know, am I a falcon, a storm, or a vast song? He's not saying I don't know what God is. He's clear what God is in this way, the ancient tower. But he asks himself the questions about himself. Am I a falcon, a storm, or a vast song? These three things, each of which need breath to swell life into themselves. Falcon, storm, great song, with breath, with air, with wind, with ruach, as you'd say in Hebrew, or spirit, aspirare, I suppose you might say in Latin, this strange thing that we believe is the most necessary part of what it means to breathe and be alive, but also somehow something that's been deified, whether in breathing practices and mindfulness, whether in the great prayer traditions of all the world. Linking it with the breath is always some way of connecting the individual body with the idea of what it means to be alive. So I'll read it again. I live my life in widening rings, which spread out to cover everything. I may not complete the last one, but I'll surely try. I'm circling around God, around the ancient tower, and I've been circling for thousands of years, and I don't yet know, am I a falcon, a storm, or a vast song? So here's another one early in the Book of Hours, number 5. I love the dark hours of my being, for they deepen my senses. In them, as old letters, I find my daily life already lived in holy words so soft and subdued. From them, I've come to know that I have room for a second life, timeless and wide. And at times, I'm like the tree, ripe and rustling, standing above the dead boy's grave, gathering him in its warm roots, fulfilling the dream he'd lost in sorrows and songs. The marginalia for this piece say, in the woods on the 22nd of September. What a lovely thing to think about, that individual tree, and then in the woods also, the conversation between these two things. You know, at times you wonder, how old was Rilke when he wrote these? I mean, he was in his 20s. At times he seems much older, and at times it feels like he's trying to step out of age. I love the dark hours of my being is a phrase that I think perhaps a lot of us would like to get to the stage of being able to say, having lived with the dark hours of all of our beings, the difficulties, the parts of ourselves that are painful. He'd been sent off to boarding school, and that had not been a pleasant experience for him. I wonder sometimes, is he talking about that in some of these poems? And especially in this most extraordinary final stanza where there's this dead boy's grave. I've read other translations where they leave this bit out. And this is one of the reasons I like Mark's translations so much, is because Mark isn't interested in making Rilke digestible, or trying to think, oh, that's not pretty enough, or I'm not sure that that would sound great in the inspirational retreat we're trying to have. Mark puts all of that in to go, well, maybe your inspirational retreat needs to have some of the edges, some of the boniness, some of the complication, and the recognition of this painful imagination of a dead boy's grave. And what Rilke does with this image is so powerful. At times I'm like the tree, ripe and rustling, standing above the dead boy's grave, gathering him in its warm roots, fulfilling the dream he'd lost in sorrows and songs. The tree is like a mother, perhaps. The tree is like psychological containment. The tree is also just another living thing, just like the boy was a living thing. And just like the boy's body, as it becomes the earth, is also a living thing. And making a living thing keep other living things alive. There's a recognition of a strange and complicated circle of life that includes death in this poem that is so brave and powerful. Here's the last one I'll read. This one has the most extraordinary marginalia. It's longer than the poem. Here's the marginalia. But in this night, the monk was woken by one of his brothers, whom he heard crying in a nearby cell. When he recognized the sound in his wakened ears, he arose, put his belt on over his robe, and went to his brother. Immediately the younger monk grew silent. The awakened one carried his brother, face moist with tears, his demeanor silent and antagonistic. Into the pale beam of moonlight streaming through the window, he took a clasped book, opened it at random, and commenced to read from the gleaming pages. That's the marginalia. And what's so powerful is that Mark's version includes this, and other translations that I've seen haven't. I'm sure there are other ones that do. Here's the poem. I pass away, like sand running through fingers of the hand. And suddenly I have so many senses, all in their different ways thirsting. I feel myself swelling and aching in 100 places, above all, in the depths of my heart. I want to die. Leave me alone. I'll surely be so racked with fear that my pulse will burst within me. There's such melodrama in this poem. Sometimes I look back at some of the poems that I wrote when I was 16, and they were filled with all kinds of drama. And what's so interesting in this is that there is this character of the younger distressed monk, that this monk praying is coming alongside and reading to. I wouldn't quite call it comforting though, because really this random page that the monk turns to in this book is a way within which a book is echoing a person's anguish back to themselves. And I find that there's something so interesting in that. There is not the desire in this imagination to say, hush, hush, you'll be fine. Neither the God character in the Book of Hours, nor the older monk character in the Book of Hours is trying to rush in to do another person's heart work for them. They seem to say, you're by yourself, and that is both the gift as well as the complication. This edition of the Book of Hours is one that I'll never give to anybody. I don't even know if I'd lend it, because it's got my notes from those weeks talking with Pat written throughout it. My friend Pat in Glasgow, who'd been the one to suggest this, and Pat's a friend of Mark's as well. And at one point, Pat, while we were talking about some of the poems, she said, God creates noise by moving through us. And I wrote that in my page, and that's become part of the book. And I think for me, that's all part of the same energy about listening to the in-betweenness of things, listening to that ever-expanding circle of orbiting around that ancient tower, whatever that ancient tower is, and discovering a strange landscape that is at once unknown, but also, if you can bear it, strangely comforting. And it's almost like whatever Rilke was listening to, Pat was listening to too. And I was listening to Pat as she was listening to that thing that Rilke was listening to, which is that thing which all of us are listening to, which is trying to bear it if we can, even for small minutes of time, the possibility of paying attention to the in-betweenness of things and being fully present to what's happening in order that we might be able to see it. And by seeing it, it can offer us something powerful. That's the end. Thanks very much, Mark, for the opportunity, and to the Poets' Corner.
Wonderful, wonderful, Pádraig. And if that's the end, it's really only a powerful beginning, a rich beginning. Thank you so much. Oh my, I feel like we have such an abundance already. And it's my joy and privilege to welcome and introduce the third and final speaker this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are, Stephanie Dowrick. Stephanie is a Rilke scholar who stands with the best and the brightest Rilke scholars we have, but she has something that most of them don't have, and that's an inner passion for what Rilke is onto or after. Pádraig mentioned how important strangeness is in one of the poems he read. And it's that strangeness that Rilke knows about. And he helps us find that in ourselves, that unknowable part of who we are. Stephanie's devoted her life to being with that strangeness as a psychotherapist, as a leading award-winning journalist, as a New Zealander who spent a good part of her life in Germany and in the UK, founding a press, the Women's Press, and leading that press through some remarkable years. And at this point, she's living near Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia. She's currently quarantined because she just flew in. It's a little after 6 a.m. for her, so we're very grateful that she's here. In that book that I mentioned, I should say she's also an award-winning, best-selling novelist, so she's a woman of many talents. In the book I mentioned a moment ago, In the Company of Rilke, she ends with this remarkable paragraph. Choice arises. The ambiguities, hyperboles, despairs, abstractions, and complexities make it difficult sometimes to read Rilke or even to think about him. Yet in the yearning for riches, for unfolding inner space, illumination, connection, and perhaps divine transformation, we make crucial choices. And perhaps it is those characteristics of ambivalence and contradiction precisely that make the irrational truths that Rilke's poetry offers still more compelling, and the divine radiance within that poetry still more familiarly human. Thank you for that book, Stephanie, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
So thank you to everybody who wanted to be in the company of Rilke from wherever you are. It's a wonderful thing to be with you and wonderful to take part in this program. And I want to acknowledge the traditional people of the Larrakia Nation from whose land I'm meeting you. The traditional owners of this land are part of a culture that is the oldest living culture in our whole world. So it is a great honor for me to be speaking to you from their nation, which is at the very, very top of Australia. So I'm close to Indonesia and far from the global cities that would be much more familiar to you. And I really want to thank also and acknowledge my own husband, Paul Bowett, who is here with us today. And it is through him that I am here today in this particularly extraordinary land. And I was thinking about this yesterday because I wanted to talk about placelessness. Placelessness is one of the great themes in Rilke's work, that we expand beyond any notion of place, but we can only acknowledge that expansion when we also know where we are placed. And one of the things that I think is such a revelation and such an anchoring and such a surprise and such a richness when we come to Rilke is to discover how this rather aesthete, small, fastidious, difficult man was also able to conjure the world of our senses so magnificently. He was probably able to conjure the world of the senses rather better than he lived them. However, that's also part of his attraction, that all of these contradictions live in Rilke. And as Pádraig said about Mark's translation, some of the translations strip the contradictions, and please don't embrace that. We are creatures of contradiction. And when we meet Rilke, and when we come into the company of Rilke, our contradictions are fully allowed. But something else that is fully, fully allowed is the intimacy of the word you. Whether one is addressing this mystery, this intimate mystery that we call God as you, du, never see in German, du, or whether I'm addressing you now individually as well as collectively, whether I'm using you singular or you plural, which in English, of course, we can do simultaneously. We are reaching to our interconnectedness and we are reaching to our uniqueness. And I so love that. And I want to start with a poem that Mark and I particularly love and that we're going to use as our first poem in our collected work together. Whoever you are. Just that phrase, hey? Whoever you are. Doesn't that invite you into a great acceptance of whoever you are in a world in which so many parts of ourselves can seem pretty unacceptable? And Rilke's transcending all of that and saying, whoever you are, in the evening, step out of your room where you know everything. Yours is the last house before the far off, whoever you are. With your eyes, which in their weariness barely free themselves from the worn out threshold, you lift very slowly one black tree and place it against the sky, slender, alone. And you have made the world. And it is huge and like a word which grows ripe in its silence. And as your will seizes on its meaning, tenderly, your eyes let it go. what he's describing for me there are the multiple processes of inwardness. And to a very great extent, I prefer this word inwardness to the word that is much more commonly used, which is spirituality, which has somehow been commercialized or, I don't know, lessened in its power. Because we are, of course, spiritual beings, but let that not be commodified. Let that be a call to liberation, that we are not here to be brought into line, that we are not here to be judged and separated one from another, as some of the fundamentalisms, not just of religion, but also of political ideology, would squash us into a box. Whenever we are feeling squashed, let us return to Rilke and remind ourselves that whoever we are, we can lift our eyes to the horizons and celebrate whoever we are and the mystery of what we are becoming and the mystery of what is becoming within us. Because we are in these poems, as Mark alluded to, we are not only reading the great thing about great poetry, although I should probably not use the word great, the great thing about true poetry, and it was Rilke who said, there is only one poet. The poet moves through us if we are lucky, if we are fortunate, if we are willing to surrender what we already know from the tired threshold. Then we are also poeted, we are also read, we are also liberated. It's never a one way. It is never a one way. I'm going to also read a couple of poems from the Prayers of a Young Poet, which I particularly like. And, you know, I would not have minded a jot if I'd read the same poem as somebody else, because each of us is also bringing that whoever you are to it, which eliminates all this nonsense about right or wrong readings. Read it, not just whoever you are, but read the poetry however you are and in whatever moment you are. And as he says in another poem that I'm not reading right now, but let everything happen, beauty and terror. Let everything happen. Don't divide your life into the acceptable and the unacceptable, because your life is not for dividing. All right, so here's a delicious poem from the Prayers. And remember, these were written by a young man who in the parts of himself, very much like ourselves, had very different layers of maturing. So his emotional maturing was lagging in so many ways. And I write a lot about that. And I hope very compassionately in my book, In the Company of Rilke, and I hope compassionately because it is true for all of us that we can have astonishing insight, and yet in our lived experience, we can be working towards insight, which is the rich reward as life unfolds. So here he's addressing God, but it's not the God of the dogma. It's not the God of the institutional church. It's the God of the heart and the soul and of the unknowing. I love you. You, softest law by which we ripened in our wrestling. You, great homesickness that we had not mastered. You, forest from which we never emerged. You, song that we sang in every silence. You, dark net, within which these fleeing feelings were snared. You had begun yourself with such unending vastness on that day when you began with us, and we were so ripened by your sons, had become so wide, so deeply planted, that now, in resting, you can complete yourself. Complete yourself in humans and angels and icons of the Madonnas. Let your hand rest on the ledge of heaven and mutually endure what we darkly do to you. I'm going to go straight to another poem because I can. Again, it's you, meaning this most intimate of mysteries, more intimate than the breath we breathe. We grasp you only in what we do, illuminate you only with our hands. Our every sense is but a guest here, yearning to reach beyond the world. Every sense is conceived. One feels its elegant hem and knows someone spun it. But heaven surrenders itself because it cannot choose. I don't want to know where you are. Speak to me from every place. Your eager evangelist distorts everything, and in their forgetting, neglects to look for the resonance. But I'm always approaching you with all my coming. Yet, who am I? And who are you? When neither of us understands the other. This invitation to uncertainty is a radical invitation. We resist uncertainty with every fiber of our being because we perceive ourselves in reductive terms. It takes enormous courage to know that actually, as dynamic beings living in harmony and disharmony, but inevitable interbeing with every other being on earth, and also with every other living form on this earth, that of course we are in a state, we live uncertainty. And yet we make so many pretenses that we can control it. And so when Rilke talks about surrender, for me, it's also a surrender of this grasping, as the Buddhists would tell us, the grasping of the delusion of certainty and the surrender to the uncertainty, which of course requires multiple acts of trust. Multiple acts of trust, even in what we might call the present moment. But I also want to make a little point about the music that I asked them to play just at the very beginning of this partly because music gives you perhaps the most profound invitation, because it is without words, to go inward, but also because music is a universal language. But that particular piece by the Finnish composer Arvo Pärt is called Spiegel in Spiegel, which means mirror in mirror. And our experiences are mirrored and mirroring in each other. And therefore, to make some conscious choices about the company we keep, both the outer company and the inner company that we bring into our minds. So I was very, very touched by Pádraig's story about bringing Rilke through Mark's beautiful translation into his mind during a period that he might have feared was one of loneliness, but that he actually found extraordinary company in. And before I read my final, just a moment. Before I read my final poems, I want you also to hear something of the music of the poetry. And I want you to hear it in German as well as in English, because I want you to hear what Rilke would have heard. He was a man of intense hearing. He waited even for the inspiration of hearing what was coming next. He had to learn to trust that, and he learned it partly through his years as a young man when he was a kind of secretary to Rodin, and he annoyed Rodin a great deal, and Rodin put him to thinking much more about the daily work of consciousness. But also he, of course, advanced on that to the daily work of opening oneself to what is coming from apparently without, but resides within. So I'm going to ask Mark to read you Ich finde dich in all diesen Dingen.
Ich finde dich in allen diesen Dingen, denen ich gut und wie ein Bruder bin. Aus Samen sonnst du dich in den Geringen und in den Großen gibst du groß dich hin. Das ist das wundersame Spiel der Kräfte, dass sie soll dienend durch die Dinge gehen, in Wurzeln wachsend, schwindend in die Schäfte und in den Wipfeln wie ein Auferstehen.
Thank you, Mark. Just that first line, Ich finde dich, I find you. I'm going to read the whole poem in English in a moment, but the intimacy of that, it's like Ich liebe dich, Ich finde dich, I find you. We long to find, we long to meet, we long even more to be met. And I think that's what you're finding in these poems, that you are not just finding and meeting, but you are met. Excuse me. I find you in all these things of the world that I love calmly, like a brother. In things no one cares for, you brood like a seed. And to powerful things you give an immense power. Strength plays such a marvelous game. It moves through the things of the world like a servant, groping out in roots, tapering in trunks, and in the treetops, like a rising from the dead. So I'm going to come to the last of my readings. I think I've just got a few more moments. Now, a lot of what we've heard today has come from Rilke, the very young man. And what I'm about to read to you comes from Rilke in the last year of his life. when very, very, very reluctantly, he was somehow facing that he was going to leave his body, leave his physical body, and he was not at all ready. He was only in his 50s. He didn't want to die. He didn't want to leave this earthly realm. He was actually quite desperate to stay much, much longer. During this last year of his life, he continued a pattern that he had had through much of his life. Quite a lot is written about Rilke's views on intimacy and solitude. And in fact, I've written a book called Intimacy and Solitude, which is perhaps one of my best known books. And I didn't write it at all with Rilke in mind. But of course, when I came later to do my big work on Rilke, I was a little bit smiling around all of this. But he had a great deal of difficulty with intimacy of the more connected kind. And he had much more ease with intimacy when the object of his devotion was not quite next door, even though he wrote a poem about God being next door. So his great intimate loves his great intimate love on the physical plane was not his wife, Clara Westhoff, or any of the many, many women who helped him in so many ways, but it was Lou Andreas Salome, the brilliant Lou, who had to keep him at some distance to his great chagrin. And the play between the intimate and the elusive divine is also very, very powerful for him. But in the last year of his life, he had a correspondence with the much younger poet, the Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva, and she hoped for more, as so many had hoped for more, and he couldn't give her more. But what he did give her were glimpses of a way of perceiving the world that he is also giving us. And this is about where I'm going to finish. And this is not in any way considered to be a major poem or an important poem or one that you would necessarily study, but I absolutely love it. And he wrote it in an area of Switzerland where he was living in this final part of his physical existence. And it was called the Valais. And he described it as not only among the loveliest of landscapes I have ever seen, but also to an amazing extent, offering manifold reflections of our inner world. And this is a very important little insight from him, that there is no separation between the inner world and the outer world. It's a complete delusion. We take in the outer world and we make something of it in the inner world, and then we give it back. And so he wrote this just sitting on a stone in this field when he was writing, doing his best with intimacy on the page, writing to Marina and also to us. Oh, the losses into the all, Marina, the stars that are falling. We can't make it larger wherever we fling ourselves, to whatever star we may go. In the whole, all things are already numbered. So when anyone falls, the perfect sum is not lessened. Whoever lets go in his fall dives into the source and is healed. Waves, Marina, we are ocean. Depths, Marina, we are sky. Earth, Marina, we are earth. 1,000 times April. Praising my dearest, let us be lavish with praise. Nothing really belongs to us. As angels draw marks as a signal on the doors of those to be saved, we, though we seem to be tender, stop and touch this or that. Ah, how remote already, how inattentive, Marina, even in our innermost presence, even in our innermost pretense, signal us, nothing more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for such a deep and moving sharing and bringing us to that marvelous poem where Rilke is looking into the depth of his life and at the same time beyond himself and his finitude. Thank you to all three of you for such a rich, rich afternoon together. And I'd like to, we only have a few more minutes left, but I'd like to turn back to Pádraig and to you, Laura, and to invite you to respond now that you've been washed in this ocean of remarkable meditations on these poems. What one vision, one image, one theme would you like to leave us with as we prepare to depart today? Laura, I'll begin with you.
Oh, I thank you so much to both of you, Pádraig and Stephanie. I really enjoyed your readings and your thoughts so much. And I guess, Stephanie, was just talking about this idea of interbeing and connectedness. And that's one a powerful central theme, I think, in Rilke, the open, that thing that we as adult humans, we turn ourselves backwards to it, right? So he thought, I believe I'm sort of going on the 8th elegy here, that little children or animals or flowers, they were completely open to the vastness of connection. And I heard that a lot in your remarks, Stephanie, and I love that sort of final takeaway from Rilke. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Pádraig?
Just as you were speaking there, Laura, I looked out the window and a rabbit ran across the garden in front of me. And I found myself thinking about what Stephanie was saying, which is the shaping of the you. That the tree is the you, the rabbit is the you, the little woodpecker we saw earlier on. And that somehow this attention to you is the thing that Rilke paid so much attention to, without, I think, what you often find is a profoundly anxious energy to define the you. It seems somehow that the poem rested in his throat by saying that do, by saying that you, and that the poem and the prayer found a location there without the need for any anxious final definition. And I find that endlessly moving.
Oh, thank you. And that you is at once intimately familiar and profoundly strange. I come back to your naming of that so eloquently, Pádraig, the strangeness of these poems that refuses to be read like you would read the little lyric on a Hallmark card, which you throw away and never think about again. But the puzzlement that these poems bring, that invite us into the strangeness in ourselves.
And also, I love the way it's so about relationship in all of his poems. Our relationship, this very intimate relationship with this God, and it's a two-way street in Rilke. Rilke goes so far as to even kind of speak of himself as sort of a creator of God, and God, of course, being the creator of the humans. I love that very intimate interaction. So it's you, but it's also, this whole relationship.
And one of his comments in the journal he kept while he was in Florence, he writes, "God, you're the oldest work of art and very badly tended."
I'd just like to make one more comment about whoever you are. I wrote a lot in my book and in my study of Rilke about the questions of translation. And I want you to, I'd love you to acknowledge also that each of us is a translator, that none of us receives what's on the page in exactly the same way. We receive it in that Quaker phrase as it speaks to our condition. And so I really want to urge you to take permission to read what you are reading today and what you are feeling today, but also to read it ideally through the heart and the greater mind, with the embrace that each of the speaker has talked about. So the translations that I have resisted most are those that seek to confine. And actually, Rilke himself wrote a great deal about the confinements of so much of our thinking. And so I want to return again to that word about liberating your thinking, allowing so much spaciousness in your thinking, and getting rid of too many ideas of right and wrong and competition and hierarchy, because each moment of sensual experience of words and taking them inwards and giving them out is in itself something so precious. It is the holiest of communions.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Stephanie. Sadly, I think we've come almost to the end of our time. A last word, Laura, Pádraig.
I was, one of the poems I was going to read was that one that starts, "God speaks to each one of us only before we're made." And then it finishes off with that line, "Give me your hand." And there's something about the extraordinary way within which so much of his work is about the worlds that we live in and the worlds that we carry. And at the same time, he has this technique about coming to the body and coming to the material reality within that. And that, though that's not a contradiction, of course, they're held together. And I think that that's such a useful thing. I liked how Stephanie spoke about inwardness as a way, because spirituality has become often so esoteric in terms of conversation, but the physicality of inwardness too, and the fact that we're talking about a turning in that way. I think that that was a very helpful way of capturing so much about an energy that's present without any contradiction in Rilke's work.
Yes, and from the same poem, a different translation, but I love the longing in Rilke's work. "Go to the limits of your longing, embody me." That's spoken in the voice of God. So, follow this, acknowledging and following this longing we have for the transcendent, and embody me. That's an invitation. That's an invitation to coming into divine transformative union. So it just over and over again speaks to me so deeply.
Oh, it's just beautiful.
It's another phrase in that marvelous poem: "Flare up like flame, make giant shadows that I can move in."
Yeah.
And that's really profound. Make giant shadows that I can move in. Let everything happen. Beauty and terror.
Yeah, an amazing poem. I'd like to close with a different poem written a couple of years after he wrote those early poems. And let me simply say, because there were some comments in the chat room, what is this book? Thank you all for referring to it, The Prayers of a Young Poet. It's the first version of what became part 1 of the Book of Hours. And there is no other translation of this that includes the marginal notes. In fact, it's almost never included in any edition, because when he published it as a single book in 3 parts, his editor, Klippenberg, told him you can't have those notes in part 1 unless you have them in part 2 and 3. And Rilke said, well, I only wrote them in part 1. So he lost to the editor, and I think it was a loss for the book. So if you'd like to find those marginal comments, you can find them in the original German edition, or you can find them in my translation. And Pádraig, thank you for reading several of them. They are, some of them, poems in their own right, really exquisite. I want to
Mark,
close
before
with,
you read, because I would love to have you close with your reading of this final poem. So if I could just say a couple of things. One is several people in the chat asked for names of the books and poems. So I will put those on the website afterwards, so you can come to the website for any references. A lot of them referring to Mark's translation, but there was Stephanie's book and so many things referred to. So we'll put those on the website. And just a reminder to come back November 14th, and actually to go to the website and follow the link to the gallery in case you would like to submit poems for this wonderful ekphrastic conversation between visual art and poetry that is next on the Poets Corner. And then I just want to say thank you. I feel like my world has been expanded this afternoon. And it's touched me in so many ways, and from each of you. And such gratitude to you, Mark, for bringing these folks together and for sharing your knowledge and your depth. So I want you to have the last word. Thank you.
thank you, Meg. And it is just a joy to thank Meg and Catherine for organizing Poets Corner, and to all of you who've joined us for this very special time together. And I'd like to thank each of you, Laura and Pádraig and Stephanie, for your deep generosity of heart and mind, for the deep humanness that you've brought to reading Rilke and opening your readings to us, and for your graciousness. It's an old-fashioned word. The gracious way you've helped us look into our own hearts, into our own souls, into our own innerness, and discover there is something richer that was always there that we may not have glimpsed as deeply, and perhaps never learned yet to truly gaze upon. You've helped us enter that gaze. I'd like to end with a poem that Rilke used as the opening poem for a collection that Laura referred to earlier, the book of images or pictures, Das Buch der Bilder. It's a hard one to translate. It's a very short poem, and I hope it's a poem that will carry you into your evening or morning or whatever time it is where you live. He called it the initial, the opening poem, and I'll read it in German, 5 lines long, and then in English. Gib deine Schönheit immerhin, ohne Rechnen und Reden. Du schweigst. Sie sagt für dich, ich bin. Und kommt in tausendfachem Sinn, kommt endlich über jeden. Share your beauty always, without measurement or speech. You keep silent. And that speaks for you. I am. And comes forth in a 1,000-fold way, comes finally to each one of us. To all of you who have gathered for this program, I know you'll join me in thanking Laura and Stephanie and Pádraig. And to you, I give you Rilke's encouragement. Share your beauty always, without measurement or speech. Blessings to you all. And a very special thanks for this time together.
Thank you all. This was really wonderful and just such a wonderful listening audience.